You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 4th of November 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up.
As president, I will do everything in my power to end the war in Gaza, ensure Israel is secure, and ensure the Palestinian people can realize their right to dignity, freedom, security, and self-determination.
It's a crooked country, and we're going to make it straight. We're going to make it straight, and it's not an easy thing to do. Think of it. They cheated elections, and you call them on it, and they want to put you in jail. Think about it. We've proven something, we've shown something, and we're going to get it fixed, and we got to win this election.
With just a day to go and more than 75 million ballots already cast, we'll be in Washington to begin the countdown to the US presidential election and examine the two candidates' approach to war in Ukraine.
And Trump has taken a different approach. He says, we don't have an interest in this war. We just want to stop the killing. And he wants to force basically a Munich-like peace on Ukraine.
Also ahead, Monday's papers, the British film director Steve McQueen talks to Monocle Radio about his new film Blitz, and we find out why crows hold grudges. That's all ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, to look at what else is happening in today's news. King Felipe of Spain says he understands the anger and frustration of people in the Valencia region who were hit by last week's floods. Russian forces have attacked Ukraine's second largest city of Kharkiv. At least 5 people have been injured. And Moldova's pro-EU President Maia Sandu has claimed a second term after a tense election runoff seen as a choice between Europe and Russia. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, this is going to go to the wire, or so the pundits suggest. The intensity of campaigning across the swing states by presidential candidates Kamala Harris and Donald Trump has been such that this weekend Ms. Harris was seen stepping off her aircraft in North Carolina, just meters from where Mr. Trump's plane was parked. The final set of polls by the New York Times saw Vice President Kamala Harris showing new strength in North Carolina and Georgia as former President Donald Trump erases her lead in Pennsylvania and kept ahead in Arizona. Well, to read the runes and predict a rather interesting week, I'm joined now by Monocle senior news editor Chris Chermak in Washington, D.C. A very warm welcome back, Chris. How are things? How are your runes?
How are my rooms? It's quite a time. What can I tell you, Emma? It's crazy. It's been a crazy weekend. Seeing some of the campaigns, being at Donald Trump's rally. We're just getting ready for a final week. What a final week it's going to be.
Well, let's talk about Trump's rally in Pennsylvania. How was that? I mean, from all reports, it felt angry, and this was the moment when Donald Trump began to talk about in real intensity the idea that Kamala Harris was going to steal the election.
He absolutely did. It was quite striking, partly because he seemed to also realize throughout the rally that he was going entirely off script at this point. He mentioned that he wasn't talking with the teleprompters or wasn't reading the teleprompters, and he focused so much of his energy on specifically this idea that the election might be stolen by Kamala Harris. He focused a lot of his energy on the media as well as we were standing there. This famous comment, although I will say that one was more of a joke. He has his dark humor about, you would be able to shoot through the fake news media in order to get to him, and he wouldn't mind that particularly. So he was really going for it, I would say, in this rally. And it is something that, of course, are going to make his own staffers very uncomfortable, because his comments from this Pennsylvania rally have dominated the news cycle here over the last 24 hours, far more than anything else that would be on message about the economy, the kind of things where he can really hit home against Kamala Harris, inflation, all those things. I will fix it. Trump will fix it. Those are meant to be the taglines that he should be going for. Of course, he said them, but most of his focus really was on how this election might be stolen from him in a couple of days.
Which predicts perhaps what might be happening in about 3 or 4 days' time. But let's talk about what Kamala Harris, who's been saying that Donald Trump has been appearing unhinged for quite a long time. She made a very strong statement in Michigan about Gaza, which is a subject which has really, really pushed a large proportion of Muslim voters away from her, isn't it?
It is, and I think what's interesting here is that while this was not off script, this was clearly planned by Kamala Harris in Michigan. It's not something she has done until now much in the campaign. I was at one of her rallies also in Washington, D.C. Earlier last week at the Ellipse. There was a big group of pro-Palestinian protesters at that rally, and she did not make mention of Gaza during that speech. She focused a bit on democracy, given it was where Donald Trump had sort of incited his group ahead of January 6th. And then she turned to the economy and character and lots of other issues, but not so much the Middle East. This time she really went for it directly. She said it had been an uncomfortable year. And you heard the clip at the top of our show about kind of how she promised to end the war in Gaza, which got a very large response. So I think that was significant, if you will, given that this is the final couple of days. She could have focused on the economy. She could have focused on women's rights, which she did, of course, all the issues that are her important issues. But she is also kind of going after some of those either undecided voters or those voters that are reluctant to vote for her. And that, of course, includes Muslim Americans in Michigan.
Look, are there any undecided voters left still? Because there are these very important 7 swing states, but is there a sense that most people have already decided and that is it?
There is pretty much a sense that everyone's decided at this point. I mean, a couple of the people I spoke to at the Trump rally obviously were very decided. One person told me that she was maybe 5% undecided, and it depended on what she would hear from Donald Trump. So just to give you an example, anecdotal example there. But no, this is really all about getting out the vote, which is why this point about Gaza in Michigan is important. At this point, it is about trying to convince those voters to actually go out and vote on November 5th. So it's more about that. Most voters at this point are going to be decided, but, are they energized? Are they willing to make the effort to actually go to the polls on November 5th? That is really the question right now. That's where the campaigns are focusing all of their energy.
And in these 7 states, it must feel overwhelming. I mean, what have you seen when you've been out on the road? Because everybody in those areas has been overwhelmed by a deluge of political advertising. I think $1 billion has been spent in campaigning in the last week alone. What does that feel like?
Oh, it's absolutely overwhelming. I mean, it is everywhere, frankly, Emma. Even here. I mean, I'm currently in Maryland. I've gone back from Pennsylvania earlier today, or yesterday for where you are. But yes, it is absolutely overwhelming. The number of ads you will see on television, it is an absolute deluge. The fact that the campaigns are, of course, there all the time. That said, when you go to a rally like this, these are the people who are, of course, energized. They want to be there. They're happy to be able to see the candidates. So there is something special about what these swing states get. They get to see the candidates and their surrogates up close repeatedly in these final weeks.
Let's talk a little bit about certain states where things are moving in this way that, basically we're unable to predict, but there are polls suggesting certain bits of movements. Iowa is one place that Donald Trump could have considered a safe place for him, but now it appears that Kamala Harris is ahead.
Yeah, this is the kind of poll that has been making the waves over the last 24 hours. From Des Moines, the paper there, suggesting that Kamala Harris is up 3 points. It's an interesting one purely because neither candidate has really even campaigned in Iowa. It is assumed to be a clear red state, one that would go for Donald Trump. Most polls have suggested that up to this point. This is an outlier of a poll, and so make of that what you will. but it is interesting, a few 48 hours before the election, you're going to have a poll like this make some noise. Donald Trump focused on this at his rally in Pennsylvania as well. He was very angry about this poll. He was angry about polls in general, anything that suggested he wasn't going to win. But I do think it's important to maybe take these with that little bit of a grain of salt, partly because many people have already voted. About 75 million people have voted already early. But also, these final polls compared to, say, the run of polls we've been having over the last week or so, has anyone really changed their mind to that point of undecided voters you were saying earlier? Not so likely. So, is Iowa really going to go for Kamala Harris? That feels unlikely. If it does, well, then she's in for a big win.
It's interesting you mentioned the people who've already voted, because I think that the New York Times survey said that across these 7 swing states, 40% of those surveyed had already cast their ballot. So there does seem to be a sort of a diminishing return in terms of the number of people that Harris and Trump can actually call upon to step out on Tuesday. The decision has been made by so many places. But the interesting thing that the Times is saying is that actually Harris is winning these voters by a big margin as well, 8 percentage points.
Yes, there has been enthusiasm among the early voting. That's not necessarily a surprise, Emma, in partly because, first of all, Donald Trump himself has not always discouraged early voting among Republicans, so that's something that's significant. But yes, also you are seeing some amount of energy, I would say, at this point. The New York Times poll did suggest that some of the momentum is heading towards Kamala Harris's way. There were significant numbers in North Carolina, for example, as well, that are being focused on where she's up. Georgia, where she's up. Pennsylvania is extremely tied between the two. So this really is going to come down to the end. And what I would say to your point about, early voting versus November 5th, that goes back to this. Yes, on the one hand, there are diminishing returns at this point. On the other hand, this is really the point where it's all about squeaking out those final people, those people who might not be voting at all. Those are the ones you need to actually get to turn out on November 5th. So we'll see which campaign has the better ground game there. That's where at least much of the reporting has been that Kamala Harris has a bit of an edge as well. Whether it will actually help, who knows? So
we're into the week when the election happens. There is a suggestion that depending on the result, the winner may not be properly declared or indeed may contest what happens on Tuesday night going into Wednesday morning. Keeping something back in the tank, I hope, for us, Chris. What are your plans for the next day or so? And what will we hear from you on Monocle?
Oh, you're going to hear plenty from us on Monocle, Emma. As our listeners may know, we've had the Monocle Daily coming out of Atlanta for the last 4 days. That my team from Atlanta will be joining me here in Washington, D.C., and we will be live with a series of shows coming out of Washington, D.C., pretty close to the White House on Tuesday and Wednesday. We will be with you for the evening of the results. We'll be with you for the next day. We'll have lots of people coming into our little pop-up studio here to talk about the day of the election and the days after to see whether this is going to be called, what the result is going to be. We're going to be with a bunch of other reporters from different outlets as well, so it's going to be an interesting atmosphere at our base in Washington, D.C. We'll be bringing plenty of people on to dissect every little bit of this and get that sense of kind of how the world is looking at this election as well.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's talk about something that we've just heard about in the headlines, which is the fact that Russian forces have attacked Ukraine's second largest city of Kharkiv, with at least 5 people being injured. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has been a huge subject, and it is one of the great differentiators between the two candidates, saying an awful lot about their approach to global affairs. Chris, tell us who you've been interviewing about this.
So I've been speaking to Ian Brzezinski, who's a very interesting figure. He's a former Defense Department official who is now with the Atlantic Council. He's been a very vocal advocate for American engagement in the world and American engagement in Ukraine in particular. He's written an op-ed recently this week accusing Donald Trump of wanting to have a Munich-style agreement in order to appease Russia when it comes to Ukraine. So he's been incredibly outspoken about this race, even though he is a Republican himself. Let's have a little listen to what he told me. I began by asking him whether he was surprised by the relatively low profile that the war in Ukraine has been playing in this election.
I'm actually surprised by the profile that it has in this election. Usually U.S. elections are very domestically focused. Foreign policy really isn't a driving paramount concern. Yet it's interesting to see that Russia's invasion of Ukraine and how the United States should respond to that invasion, how it should or shouldn't support Ukraine's defense of that invasion, has actually percolated to some of the more actively engaged issues in this campaign. And I think the role that it's played is to kind of really differentiate the two candidates. Clearly, Harris and Trump have two very different postures on what to do to support Ukraine. Harris has been very clear that she will continue Biden's support of Ukraine. She said she wants Ukraine to win. She says that if Putin wins in Ukraine, it's likely that he'll go on with further aggression in Europe. She says it will set an example for other dictators around the world. Of course, she's referring to China. And Trump has taken a different approach. He says, we don't have an interest in this war. We just want to stop the killing. And he wants to force basically a Munich-like peace on Ukraine, forcing it to cede territory. So two very different approaches, which kind of reveals the different approaches to world affairs the two leaders have. Vice President Harris will continue Biden's outlook of looking at global leadership as both a responsibility and an opportunity to promote and serve U.S. values and interests around the world. It's an outlook that views alliances and allies and friends as advantages, arrows in our quiver, so to speak, to protect our interests. And Trump, of course, very different. He brings a kind of a grievance-filled approach to international relations, very consistent with his grievance-filled approach to domestic political situation, where he feels been abused by the elites, the left, our legal system, our politics. Similarly, he looks at the world as an arena which has abused American largesse. Our allies have taken advantage of us. They've freeloaded off of us. He's distrustful of international organizations. He looks at the alliance not as a strength, but as a burden. He's almost more comfortable working with our adversaries, particularly great power adversaries. He feels he can get a better deal with them rather than from our allies who've been abusing our largesse over the years. So Ukraine has kind of highlighted these differences between the two candidates.
When it comes to those differences and the arguments around that for America's place in the world, how effectively do you feel this argument has been made that American engagement in the world, American engagement in Ukraine is a domestic issue? Because that's the way that you get through, right? That's the way that foreign policy does play a role in a U.S. election, is if you can highlight the role that it plays for U.S. national security. How well do you feel that argument has been going right now?
One of the misunderstandings I constantly come across from foreigners coming in, asking questions about the elections, is the perception that America has gone nativist, has gone isolationist. But when you look at polling, Americans are surprisingly internationalist, particularly in the context when you have one of the major presidential candidates taking a very different approach. I mean, think about the fact that 60 to 70% of Americans believe we should have an active role in world affairs. 60 to 70 of higher percent of Americans feel we should sustain our commitment to NATO or increase it. Think that 75% of Americans want Ukraine to win. And consistently, 60% of Americans support the assistance that we've been giving to Ukraine. There's been no outcry against U.S. military deployments and engagements, not just in Europe, but now increasingly and quite active in the Middle East and in the Indo-Pacific. And what's really interesting is when you look at the Trump base, the MAGA right, so to speak, there's a great set of polling that was done by the Ronald Reagan Institute that shows that the MAGA base is actually far more internationalist in outlook than their leader, Donald Trump. Well over 60% of them think NATO is an asset.
if that is the case, what makes you think that this is seen among that Republican establishment, or rather the new Republican establishment of Donald Trump, that this is an election winner, that this is something that they are pretty focused on, even if, as you say, a lot of the polling would suggest it's not necessarily a winner?
And surprising to me, particularly in the case of Ukraine, where in states that are swing states, where there are significant Central European populations whose votes could actually turn the outcome in those swing states. So I wouldn't be going to Wisconsin, I wouldn't be going to Pennsylvania and saying we should have a Chamberlain-like deal with Putin and give part of Ukraine away. That doesn't resonate very well with Polish American voters, Ukrainian American voters, Baltic American voters. Yet he's doing that. So I don't think Trump is so much responding on foreign policy issues to what his base is saying, as much as he truly actually believes it and is committed to it. And he just is willing to voice that hell or high water.
The other conflict that's going on right now, the war in Gaza and the war in Lebanon, it's an intractable problem, frankly, also for the U.S. that has it sort of distracted from the more simple one, if you will, when it comes to Ukraine, because Ukraine is a far more clear-cut, perhaps, example of where the U.S. should stand, how it should be engaged, than Gaza, which has become politically, morally, and militarily a much more complicated one.
It is far more complex. There are far more actors involved. There are different factions within each of the major groups that are engaged, be it Iran, be it the different terrorist groups. Even in Israel, there are different factions. So it's clearly not a conflict that is going to be resolved easily. The lines aren't as clear, for example, as you have in Central Europe between Russia and Ukraine. But one thing that I think is beginning to be recognized across the U.S. political spectrum is that the next administration's number one challenge is going to be preventing three contingencies from evolving into something that is perhaps you could call a global conflagration, whose potentials are far more extreme than perhaps what we saw in World War II because of technologies that could be in play, nuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction and such. And of course, those three contingencies are, of course, the Middle East, what's going on in Ukraine, but also intensifying provocations by China in the Indo-Pacific. So the most important agenda item, national security agenda item of the next administration is going to be how to ensure these three now interconnected contingencies, crises, conflicts, don't escalate into something far more destructive, far more catastrophic. That's going to be the number one challenge.
Are you worried about a more long-term disengagement if there is a Trump victory? Does it worry you that maybe certain countries would pull back and redirect their attention to other powers?
You hit it right on the head. My biggest fear of a Trump administration, and I'm a Republican who's not a supporter of the Trump administration, my fear is that particularly our European allies may overreact. I fear that their fear, abhorrence of Trump is a bit exaggerated and can lead them to take steps that would actually exacerbate the situation rather than ameliorate it. Because they go into a defensive crouch or an antagonistic crouch, it'll just further worsen the transatlantic relationship, and that will only serve our adversaries. Most immediately, of course, in Central and Eastern Europe.
That was Ian Brzezinski there, speaking to Monocle's Chris Chermak. And thanks also to Chris for joining me a little earlier on today's programme. Still to come.
I wanted to bring the reality of the environment as well. As much as one was fighting the enemy, which was the Nazis, we were fighting ourselves.
We'll hear from the acclaimed director Steve McQueen as his film Blitz hits the cinema screens. Stay with us on The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
7:24 here in London. Let's continue with today's newspapers. I'm delighted to say that joining me in this studio is Inga Thodar, Chief External Relations Officer at the Ocean-Born Foundation and former senior editor at BBC and CNN. Welcome back, Inga. How's life where you are?
It's very good, thank you.
Good.
Glad to hear it.
What have you brought us with the papers today?
Well, I want to start with a different election than the ones that are getting the most attention now. This one in Moldova. I've been watching this for a little while, just mainly because after the Georgian election, I think that region is really important. And despite the accusations of Russian meddling, the pro-Western and pro-European Maia Sandu seems to have won. She has certainly claimed victory with 55% of the vote so far. I think more than 99% have been counted against her sort of pro-Russian opponent, Alexander Stoianoglu, who's got 44% of the vote, but has not conceded victory. I think that's really important to point out that he might challenge all of this. But so far, it looks like Moldova is going in a different direction to what Georgia did.
And this is interesting insofar as 24 hours ago, the supporters of Maia Sandu were crying foul very loudly. They were saying that Russia has really meddled in these elections. And even a matter of 12 hours ago, when we were watching the polls, it looked like Stoianoglu might have actually clinched it, because this absolutely went down to the wire. So this isn't just a sort of which direction is Moldova going. It's how does Moldova navigate its incredibly tricky position between a European direction and also the magnetism of Russia, unwillingly or willingly, however you want to put it.
Yeah, no doubt about that. And the recent referendum on the EU or joining the EU, what really came down to the wire as well, and that was considered to be not very good for Mrs. Sandu, because there was an expectation that result would be much more resoundingly pro-European. But in this election, like in the European election, it's believed that the diaspora was the one that managed to get it across the line. And that is what is interesting here, is that the diaspora turned out in great numbers to vote. And on the whole, they are anti-Russian. But I mean, you cannot underestimate the influence of Russia in that region, just geographically and also culturally. So I think that, the meddling of Russia, even if so far we haven't heard any sort of independent verification of that, they have meddled in every other election there, so there's no reason to believe that they haven't done so this far as well.
And one of the interesting things about what Mr. Stoianoglu's campaign included was that he promised the revival of cheap Russian gas supplies. I mean, that is an incredibly attractive idea to an electorate which is suffering a crisis with money like anybody else.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, he did promise and probably has opportunities to make that promise, given his strong relationship with Russia. But I think what the Moldovans did very well is that they started to fight against the Russian misinformation and meddling very early on. They strengthened their institutions, they strengthened their media, and that has helped them. That sort of long-term plan has paid off, and it looks like Mrs. Sandu is going to be the next, or continue to be the president of Moldova, which would undoubtedly take the country in a pro-Western, pro-European direction.
Let's move on to coverage of what's happening in Spain. Yesterday, the general communications rule is, if you are a senior figure, either a leader, a CEO, a king, and your country is suffering, you roll up your sleeves, you put on a cheap pair of Wellingtons, and you get down there and you are seen to be talking to people. It's rule number one. This backfired phenomenally for King Felipe yesterday, didn't it?
It did, and not just him, but also for Prime Minister Sanchez and the Queen. They turned up with an entourage to come and look at the devastation, rather than, as you say, roll up their sleeves and do the right thing. And this came as anger was already building because of the slow response, that the warnings had been given way too late for people to evacuate. So there was already anger towards the established, the government and the both regional and national. But in this case, it just really blew over when people saw the resources that were being used for that one visit, while on the sidelines, all these rescue workers were continuing to try to work through mud and, dirt and trying to rescue people. So it just felt very well, it didn't feel like they had kind of figured out what they were walking into, and then having to cancel the second leg of their visit as well did not look good.
No, you have to read the room with this one.
Yes.
So we have this tremendous outpouring of anger, clearly, from those in Valencia who are feeling let down in an unimaginable way.
They are. And I think it came down to those sort of few things. First of all, the slow response. And I mean, there are people in the sort of epicenter of this, close to Valencia, who are, this is Payo Porta I'm talking about, and who have still not received help and are still waiting to be rescued from their homes. They're still waiting for supplies, knowing where they're going to live. And then to see their king come walking around sort of shaking hands just didn't feel like the right response at that time. And, this is not the first time, obviously, there's been floods in Spain, but the ferocity of this one, I mean, a year's worth of rain in 8 hours, you can't even imagine what that would have looked like. And the ferocity of it was such that I think people were totally shocked, and there was absolutely no response from the government really in the first sort of 24 hours afterwards. And we are now almost a week from the floods.
Let's move on to a story that's popped up in Reuters but is being widely reported. COP16, the sort of the biodiversity conservation part of COP. There have been muted responses to the amount of money that is being asked of nations to spend on preserving nature. Why do you think that people are sort of really just keeping their hands in their pockets and not dipping in further at the moment?
Well, I think it's an interesting, what the contrasting sort of argument seems to be. And I think this is what most of the sort of papers come up with, is this, that actually public money has been completely leveraged here. There is no more public money to put into this. And in fact, pledges for conservation has gone down from government. I mean, in 2015, we were looking at something around 4.6 billion. Now it's gone down to 3.8 billion. So it's actually going down. So what the officials are saying is that private money needs to come in here, and that private companies need to be much more active, and especially pharmaceutical companies who use nature for their products, and that they should be paying. And in a way, that is one of the successes of COP, that, the pharmaceutical companies lobbied very hard against having to pay any levy, but they have now been sort of pushed into that work. But there is no doubt that the shortfall is enormous. Not just, we talk a lot about the shortfall in climate financing, but the shortfall in nature-based financing is the same, and the promises that were made 2 years ago in Montreal have not materialized.
It's an interesting idea, isn't it, that when you talk about sustainability and climate change and what have you, I remember a friend of mine saying this should be like accountancy. This should actually be something which is an integral part of any company, but it doesn't become your major selling point. But everybody should just assume that you just have good accountants and good people dealing with climate change.
Yeah, it should be, but the figures are enormous. There is no agreement about where this money should come from, how it should come, and what we should stop funding in return. And there is no doubt that we have to move away from fossil fuel. Everyone will give that, but at the same time, there is no agreement about how that's going to be done, who's going to pay for that transition. I do want to say, though, about COP16, because it's really easy to focus on the sort of negative sides of things, but there were some successes, and I do think it's important for us to sort of point out. I think the new body dedicated to the indigenous people's rights, that they will speak, present as one entity in the next COP discussion, is a really good way. The standardized way to identify ocean areas of high ecological value is very important, and will sort of pave the way for the ratification of the High Seas Treaty, and the sort of recognition of the interconnection of climate and biodiversity. These were all positive things to come out of COP16. So even if progress feels sluggish, we need to celebrate the wins as well as the challenges still ahead.
Delighted to hear it. Inga Thordal, thank you so much for going through the papers with us. The time here in London is 7:33 a.m. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A look now at some of today's other news headlines. King Felipe of Spain says he understands the anger and frustration of people in the Valencia region who were hit by last week's flood. Hours earlier, he'd cut short a visit to the area after angry crowds pelted him with mud. There's been huge criticism of the late warning of the torrential rains in which 214 people are now known to have died. Russian forces have attacked Ukraine's second largest city of Kharkiv. At least 5 people have been injured. A Russian guided bomb hit a supermarket near to a residential area of the city. Health officials in Gaza say fresh Israeli airstrikes have killed at least 31 people. The attacks come as the UN's Children's Agency says that the entire population of northern Gaza is in imminent risk of death from disease, famine and ongoing bombardments. And Moldova's pro-EU President Maia Sandu has claimed a second term after a tense election runoff seen as a choice between Europe and Russia. With most votes counted, Sandu had won 55% of the votes, beating the pro-Russian candidate Alexander Stoyanoglu. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now, as we've been hearing in the headlines and also in the paper review, angry crowds pelted Spain's King, Queen and Prime Minister with mud this weekend as they visited the scenes of the country's worst floods in decades. The death toll is expected to reach much higher than the current 214, with extreme rainfall exacerbated by climate change being held as one of the reasons for the floods. Now, new analysis from the World Weather Attribution group at Imperial College here in London suggests that climate change has played a significant role in worsening extreme weather events such as what has just happened in Spain. To tell us more, Will de Freitas is Energy and Environment Editor at The Conversation UK. I'm delighted to say he joins me in the studio. Very good morning to you, Will.
Good morning.
Thank you for coming in. So what do we know about, just let's join the dots here. What do we know about what happened in Spain and climate change?
It's too early to say very specifically exactly what's happened in Spain and exactly how this specific event is connected to climate change. What we do know is that at the kind of macro level, climate change does cause, is linked to more extreme rainfall. As the atmosphere warms, it can hold more water, and that just generally means there are more intense rainfall. So similar extreme rain has been linked to climate change. In sort of recent examples, there was intense bouts of rain in Libya last year and in Dubai earlier this year. Both of those were made much more likely, in terms of Libya, 50 times more likely by climate change. So what this sort of team at Imperial does is tries to provide a link to, or sort of say as soon as possible, how likely this climate change made this event. And they're probably preparing an analysis on this specific event in Spain, but won't be ready for a few weeks.
How do they go about doing this? Because it seems to be quite a specific and rather tricky job that you can trace climate change through a specific event.
Yeah, so it's about 10 years ago they set up this group of climate scientists set up this World Weather Attribution project, which tries to link these things in this sort of more journalistic timescales, kind of in a time when people are still talking about this as an ongoing event. The big problem with, or a big problem with scientific publishing is it can take years and years to actually go from a sort of original idea to pass peer review and everything. So what they've done to kind of bypass that is they've got all their methods and stuff are already peer reviewed, and they basically just say, well, we already know that this type of extreme rainfall is made more likely by climate change, and then you can then apply that to the sort of most recent instance, and they'll sort of publish their findings before being peer reviewed and everything.
And then the usefulness of this information. Obviously, you have this very, very well respected report coming out of Imperial, but then you have to work out how that then gets communicated to governments and how they then issue or make sure that there is a certain level of preparedness, because it's twofold here, isn't it? It's we have to stop climate change, that's a given, but at the same time we have to ensure that for the climate change and its effects that are already being felt, cities, towns, villages need to be ready to deal with something.
Yeah, and being able to sort of say, this thing wouldn't have happened without climate change, or this thing was made 50 times more likely, is incredibly useful for things like saying, you know, if climate change is happening and these types of floods are 50 times more likely to happen, that's why you need to build these big flood walls, those sorts of things. That's why you need a sort of some kind of program for warning people about flooding, those sorts of things. It's also useful for holding people to account over climate change. The people behind the World Weather Attribution have said one sort of use of their work is precisely that you can start to pin individual extreme weather events on people causing climate change, and that becomes sort of, if you're saying, oh, you know, such and such fossil fuel company is responsible for such and such emissions, and that's made, you know, 0.01 degrees of extra warming, that's one thing. But if you can say you've made this specific hurricane 10 times more likely, that's far more compelling and more tangible.
And very good news for the lawyers.
It will be very good news for lawyers, yeah.
Will de Freitas, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. It's 15:40 in Tokyo, 8:40 a.m. in Zurich. Time now to talk business with Vicky Price, economist and former joint head of the UK government's economic service. A very good morning to you, Vicky. Welcome back.
Good morning.
Right. How are the markets? There's a small event happening in the United States this week. How are the markets bracing themselves?
Well, they've been volatile, but not hugely so. But of course, it all depends now on what the markets decide will be the likely outcome. So what we've seen, for example, now that some of the Harris polls seem to suggest that maybe she'll do better than people expected, we've seen a bit of a weakening in the dollar, because the expectation is that we're not going to get the type of inflation and possibly even big changes in the tax system, which would lead to greater inflation and therefore lower the chances of interest rates coming down if there is a Trump victory. So what we've seen is the markets reacting to this, and I think it's going to be a bit of up and down in all those indicators. But generally, it's quite surprising that there hadn't been even more volatility. Yes, the markets had come down more generally because of the uncertainty. But overall, I think they had priced all sorts of uncertainty in. But of course, the interesting thing about the markets there is that, and certainly about the result, is that it takes quite some time for things to settle, the counting. And yes, we may get some of the swing states perhaps declaring early, but a lot of the counting will take time, and real concerns about whether it's contested and also the length that it takes for whoever is elected to take over suggests that we are in a period of quite a lot of sort of volatility ahead.
What happened to the so-called Trump trade in all this?
Well, it seems to be sort of disappearing. But I think latest opinion polls matter hugely. So there is a little bit of an element of people taking perhaps some of the latest indicators a little bit more strongly. There are also, obviously, different views of what growth would be if there is a Trump victory or not. I mean, the expectation that he would be imposing more tariffs, for example, and therefore leading to higher inflation, that is quite a concern for many. And the fiscal side, whoever wins is one which is not particularly clear in terms of how it will be dealt with. I mean, remember that the US has a debt to GDP ratio of nearly 130%, and there had been this huge stimulus package that has been unleashed since COVID, which has continued under President Biden, and of course we had the IRA, which is the Inflation Reduction Act, encouraging loads of firms to actually produce in the US and focus on green and so on. A lot of that could change, and there is actually a concern that quite a lot of that, if there is a Trump administration, will be dismantled. So what will be replaced by is uncertain.
Let's move away from the United States and towards the Eurozone. What's happening there?
Well, the interesting thing is both the growth scenario, which looked a little bit better, and also inflation, which has gone up a little bit. The growth scenario is an interesting one because we've seen the economy sort of revive by about 0.4%, 0.4%, if you look at what happened quarter on quarter. in quarter three. A lot of it, and given recent events, it really matters, is down to Spain doing rather well. I mean, 3.8% up or thereabouts year on year. And now, of course, we've had these devastating floods and the cost to the economy. A lot of the rest of Europe not doing very much, but Germany managed to avoid recession by growing a little bit in the quarter, still down over the previous year. So it is an uncertain and quite unevenly distributed recovery, if you want to call it that, in inverted commas. Inflation has gone up to 2%, which is the target rate. Again, it varies hugely from place to place. But if you look at some of the big countries, they are very, very much around target. So that means really that the ECB should in December cut rates again. And it has been actually one of the most aggressive central banks of all of the big ones, and will cut again. And one of the reasons probably why the economy hasn't done that badly in Q3 is because of lower interest rates and faster cuts than anyone else has done.
And then given the huge shock that Europe has experienced in the last couple of years, several shocks, what does it say about the Eurozone's ability to actually sort of master its finances and its path?
Yes, well, it suggests that there is quite a lot of resilience, but huge amount of political pressure. I mean, we're seeing what's going on right now in Germany, for example, and what's happening with loads of companies feeling the strain, if you like, including in the car industry, which is quite major for Germany with cutbacks and layoffs and so on. So it's not an easy passage to lead to a new sort of structure that could perhaps lead to faster growth. But there's also been serious concern about the deficits that some countries have. I mean, look at France, in difficulty really with a very large deficit it needs to control, and again, political reverberations as a result. So the whole climate change issue is one which is dividing countries. So yes, it seems to have done better, more resilient than perhaps we had expected, but it is really at a knife edge in terms of where it's going to turn from here. And then, of course, the huge cost of Ukraine, the war there, which is also putting a lot of tensions onto loads of countries.
Vicky Price, thank you so much, as ever, for joining us on Monocle Radio. This is The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
Now, the British Oscar-winning director Steve McQueen is back with a film called Blitz, a fresh look at a period that's imbued in the country's psyche. The film follows the journey of a young boy called George, played by Elliot Heffernan, whose mother, played by Saoirse Ronan, sends him to safety in the countryside. Monocle Radio's Fernando Augusto Pacheco met Steve McQueen last week in London and asked him how he views the Blitz.
My mum sent me away.
She did it to keep you safe.
Your son did not arrive at his destination. You're responsible for his safety. Why can't you tell me? Where's my boy?
Defiance against the Nazis. I think that was everyone's takeaway. Again, defiance against sort of tyranny in a way. Step up a lip, keep calm and carry on situation. Again, during my research, you sort of do some shallow digging and you find out it was slightly different. I mean, there's the front of what that is, but also there's the reality of actually what was happening.
That's precisely what I also like in the film, because this kind of stiff upper lip kind of attitude. But the UK, the situation was not very rosy as well. It was not everyone in it together. There was a lot of that. but it was also a difficult time. There were kind of racism. Society was not as rosy and united as some people make us think.
No, it wasn't. I mean, again, my picture, I wanted to bring the reality of the environment as well, as much as, again, as I said before, as much as one was fighting the enemy, which was the Nazis, we were fighting ourselves. Again, I mean, lots of things that were embedded within this narrative in sense of way of the actual narrative of the times that people lived in, which through colonialism and so forth.
But at the same time, let's talk about something positive. One of my favorite scenes in the film is when Rita...
Oh, this is all positive.
Oh, yeah, this is all positive.
The truth is always positive.
Oh, yes, I agree with you. When Rita is dancing with her partner in a club, I mean, this is such a vivacious scene. That was beautiful and brought some color to it as well.
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, I mean, this is the reality of what was going on actually during the 30s, because there's obviously a little time before the actual, in the scene is a little bit of time before the Blitz. It was, like I said, there was lots of black clubs in central London and so forth. So, yeah, things were happening. There was a lot of people who were mixing, a lot of people who were sort of, being introduced to each other. There was a liberation within sexuality and whatnot. So, yeah, a lot of things were going on, absolutely.
I'm curious about your kind of initial ideas for the film, or when you start having the idea to do a film like this. Was it perhaps your experience in Iraq as well? Did give you some sort of knowledge about people in situation of war?
That's right. That was a starting point, because majority of people in the world, imagine how they experience war is through the media, something, and it's very abstract. Of course, it's sort of normally very graphic. It's however you receive your news on your phone or your computer, on a television, or a newspaper. It's very sort of again abstract. It's not sort of seen as something which is real as such. And I wanted to sort of, my experiences in Iraq, being actually in a war zone, I wanted to bring that to a situation which was much obviously more familiar to people like myself, which will be at home in London, in the UK.
I want to talk about the cast, because Elliot Heffernan playing George, I mean, what a revelation. How was it the process to cast the character? Well, let's be honest, he's central to the film. I mean, he's
difficult. I mean, you write the script and all of a sudden, oh, that's my goodness gracious. That's not so bad. Oh my God. Does George exist? Does this character, does this person exist? So we, myself and the casting director Nina Gold, threw our net broad and wide to open audition. And then there was George through Elliot Heffernan, and then he was just incredible. I mean, there was a stillness to him. He was almost like a silent movie star in a way. The way he was, the way he acted, you wanted to engage with his face, his huge eyes. And again, it was just one of those, there's a magnetism to him, and that was it. And yeah, it was incredible. He's never acted before. He's not an actor.
That's crazy. And talking about George, that character, is it true that you've seen a picture of a young boy from the period? That's fascinating, because of course the film is based on true events, but you had to imagine a George in your head, right? Was that picture the inspiration for George?
Yes, that was the starting point in some ways, of course, after being the war artist. I wanted to make a picture about the war during that time. As soon as I saw that photograph, I thought that was my way. And it was a photograph of a young black child, mixed race child, obviously had one parent black, white, one parent black, standing at a railway station waiting to be evacuated. And I thought, he was my in, seeing war through a child's eyes.
I mean, the cast of the film is superb. Of course, Saoirse Ronan, I mean, what an amazing role she played. But there's Benjamin Clementine as Ife. I mean, what a dignified character. I think he's one of my favorite characters. Fantastic. And I think because
he's a good character.
He's a good. Was he based on someone from real life?
Yeah, I mean, look, yeah, he's based on someone called Ite Epion, who was an actual air warden. But previously, before that, he was a law student. And when war broke out, he became an air warden. He signed up, and he's based on real characters. There's a speech in the film where he talks about race and how people are trying to divide us, which is actually a real speech he gave in Air Race Shelter. Because again, it was just one of those things where doing the research brought up so many interesting people and situations that I thought we could incorporate into our picture. But these situations, these characters had to serve the story, which was a story of Rita and George trying to reunite with his family.
Make a wish. One wish.
And that was Steve McQueen talking to Monocle's Fernanda Augusto Pacheco. Blitz is out now. Finally, any group or species whose collective noun is a murder should probably be given a bit of a wide berth. Well, now it's been established that crows not only have a rather difficult name, but they're rather difficult in themselves. They can, according to scientists, hold a grudge. For 17 years. Well, joining me down the line now is Stephen Moss, naturalist and author of many books, including The 10 Birds That Changed the World. Stephen, a very good morning to you. Welcome back to Monocle Radio.
Good morning, Anna.
Just explain this for us. Crows get cross, people made crows cross, and then crows stayed cross. Is that correct?
That's pretty much it, yeah. I mean, the great thing about birds is people always think they're stupid. Bird brain is a phrase, but crows are amongst the most intelligent living creatures. They match primates, they match dolphins in their abilities. And I think this is just another great example. Apparently a scientist dressed up back in 2006, an American scientist dressed up in basically that awful mask from Scream, I think it's one of the horror films, and annoyed some crows. And every time he wears the mask, they come and attack him. And this is years and years later. And that's just extraordinary, isn't it? But they have great memories.
Is that a grudge, or is that just is that a crow just naturally thinking, I remember that man was trying to annoy me, so I need to protect myself against him? What's the difference?
That sounds like a pretty good definition of a grudge to me. But, we shouldn't be surprised by this. Dogs recognise individuals years later, don't they? Either individuals they don't like or that they do like, and crows are basically much more intelligent than dogs.
So if you irk a crow, what's it going to do to you once it sees you again coming around the corner?
Well, a lot of birds will attack people who come into their territory. So there's stories of buzzards, for example, having a go at unfortunate postmen and women on the same route every day. They notice them, maybe it's the red uniform or something, I don't know, but they attack them. So we just need to be careful with birds because we need to remember that they have their own boundaries, they have their own territories. And if we get too close to them, some birds will alarm, they will make an alarm call. Birds like blackbirds will make that very loud, sort of repetitive alarm. But crows are a bit more feisty than that. So they may have a go at you. I'm not going to hurt you. They weigh a couple of kilograms, if that. They're not going to... they're not. I mean, that great story that swans can break a man's arm, but they can't. Birds are small and light. So just enjoy having a close-up view of a crow as it flies towards your face with its very sharp bill.
I was about to say, I still don't think I'm going to take my chances. And it's an interesting thing that so many of us consider birds to be harmless. But I mean, anybody who's watched that Hitchcock film is going to know that there is that long theory about the sort of the darker, more dangerous nature of birds.
That's right. And the great thing about that film is the original book by Daphne du Maurier set in Cornwall, it was gulls. And the reason they didn't use gulls in the film is very simple. You can't train gulls. You can train crows. Crows are cleverer. So they use crows. And you're right, it's a really horrific scene. The trouble with that, though, is that rather like Jaws and sharks, is that crows now have this reputation. Blackbirds tend to be hated by people. There's a sort of whole weird... hatred of anything like that, and crows look a bit scary. They're not. They're no different from any other birds, really, but we just need to be careful that we don't demonize them just because a Hitchcock film.
And why, therefore, are they called a murder of crows?
I don't really know that one, actually. We have murmuration of starlings, we have charm of goldfinch, we have exultation of larks. It's one of those weird ones that maybe when they gather, again, there was some kind of mythology around them. Ravens certainly have enormous mythology. I put that in my book, 10 Birds That Changed the World, that ravens, the biggest of the crows, the biggest of the small birds in the world, really, a huge bird. This is a bird that has an enormous mythology around it. So, crows are interesting. Crows, the corvid family, crows, ravens, magpies, they get demonized, but they're great birds.
And they remember. Stephen Moss, thank you so much as ever for joining us on The Globalist. That's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to the producers, Tom Webb, Hassan Anderson and Chris Chermak. Our researcher is Sana Jumani and our studio manager, Elliot Greenfield, with editing assistance from Mariella Bevan. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing's live at midday here in London. The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. I hope you can join me for that if you can. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you for listening. Have a great week.